Chapter 6 Part 1 of A Master of Mysteries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Master of Mysteries by L.T. Mead and Robert Eustace. Chapter 6 To Prove an Alibi. Part 1. I first met Arthur Cressley in the late spring of 1892. I had been spending the winter in Egypt and was returning to Liverpool. One calm evening, about 11 o'clock, while we were still in the Mediterranean, I went on deck to smoke a final cigar before turning in. After pacing up and down for a time, I leant over the taffrail and began idly watching the tiny wavelets, with their crests of white fire, as they rippled away from the vessel's side. Presently I became aware of someone standing near me, and turning, saw that it was one of my fellow passengers, a young man whose name I knew, but whose acquaintance I had not yet made. He was entered in the passenger list as Arthur Cressley, belonged to an old family in Derbyshire, and was returning home from Western Australia, where he had made a lot of money. I offered him a light, and after a few preliminary remarks, we drifted into a desultory conversation. He told me that he had been in Australia for 15 years, and having done well, was now returning to settle in his native land. "Then you do not intend going out again?" I asked. "No," he replied. "I would not go through the last 15 years for double the money I have made." "I suppose you will make London your headquarters?" "Not altogether, but I shall have to spend a good deal of time there. My wish is for a quiet country life, and I intend to take over the old family property. We have a place called Cressley Hall in Derbyshire, which has belonged to us for centuries. It would be a sort of white elephant, for it has fallen into pitiable decay, but luckily I am now in a position to restore it and set it going again in renewed prosperity." "You are a fortunate man," I answered. "Perhaps I am," he replied. "Yes, as far as this world's goods go, I suppose I am lucky, considering that I arrived in Australia 15 years ago with practically no money in my pocket. I shall be glad to be home again for many reasons, chiefly because I can save the old property from being sold." "It is always a pity when a fine old family seat has to go to the hammer for want of funds," I remarked. "That is true, and Cressley Hall is a superb old place. There is only one drawback to it, but I don't believe there is anything in that," added Cressley in a musing tone. Knowing him so little, I did not feel justified in asking for an explanation. I waited, therefore, without speaking. He soon proceeded. "I suppose I am rather foolish about it," he continued, "but if I am superstitious, I have abundant reason. For more than a century and a half there has been a strange fatality about any Cressley occupying the Hall. This fatality was first exhibited in 1700, when Barrington Cressley, one of the most abandoned libertines of that time, led his infamous orgies there. Of these even history takes note. There are endless legends as to their nature, one of which is that he had personal dealings with the devil in the large turret room, the principal bedroom at the Hall, and was found dead there on the following morning. Certainly since that date a curious doom has hung over the family, and this doom shows itself in a strange way, only attacking those victims who are so unfortunate as to sleep in the turret room. Gilbert Cressley, the young court favourite of George III, was found mysteriously murdered there, and my own great-grandfather paid the penalty by losing his reason within those gloomy walls." "If the room has such an evil reputation, I wonder that it is occupied," I replied. "It happens to be far and away the best bedroom in the house, and people always laugh at that sort of thing until they are brought face to face with it. The owner of the property is not only born there, as a rule, but also breathes his last in that old four-poster, the most extraordinary, wonderful old bedstead you ever laid eyes on. Of course, I do not believe in any malevolent influences from an unseen world, but the record of disastrous coincidences in that one room is, to say the least of it, curious. Not that this sort of thing will deter me from going into possession, and I intend to put a lot of money into Cressley Hall." "Has no one been occupying it lately?" I asked. "Not recently. An old housekeeper has had charge of the place for the last few years. The agent had orders to sell the Hall long ago, but though it has been in the market for a long time, I do not believe there was a single offer. Just before I left Australia I wired to Murdoch, my agent, that I intended taking over the place, and authorized its withdrawal from the market. "Have you no relations?" I inquired. "None at all. Since I have been away my only brother died. It is curious to call it going home when one has no relatives and only friends who have probably forgotten one." I could not help feeling sorry for Cressley as he described the lonely outlook. Of course, with heaps of money and an old family place, he would soon make new friends. But he looked the sort of chap who might be imposed upon, and although he was as nice a fellow as I had ever met, I could not help coming to the conclusion that he was not specially strong, either mentally or physically. He was essentially good-looking, however, and had the indescribable bearing of a man of old family. I wondered how he had managed to make his money. What he told me about his old hall had excited my interest, and as we talked, I managed to allude to my own peculiar hobby, and the delight I took in such old legends. As the voyage flew by, our acquaintance grew apace, ripening into a warm friendship. Cressley told me much of his past life, and finally confided to me one of his real objects in returning to England. While prospecting up country, he had come across some rich veins of gold, and now his intention was to bring out a large syndicate in order to acquire the whole property, which he anticipated was worth at least $1 million. He spoke confidently of this great scheme, but always wound up by informing me that the money which he hoped to make was only of interest to him for the purpose of re-establishing Cressley Hall in its ancient splendour. As we talked, I noticed once or twice that a man stood near us who seemed to take an interest in our conversation. He was a thickly set individual with a florid complexion and a broad German cast of face. He was an inveterate smoker, and when he stood near us with a pipe in his mouth, the expression of his face was almost a blank, but watching him closely, I saw a look in his eyes which betokened the shrewd man of business, and I could scarcely tell why, but I felt uncomfortable in his presence. This man, Wickham by name, managed to pick up an acquaintance with Cressley, and soon they spent a good deal of time together. They made a contrast as they paced up and down on deck, or played cards in the evening, the Englishman being slight and almost fragile in build, the German of the bulldog order, with a manner at once curt and overbearing. I took a dislike to Wickham, and wondered what Cressley could see in him. "Who is the fellow?" I asked on one occasion, linking my hand in Cressley's arm and drawing him aside as I spoke. "Do you mean Wickham?" he answered. "I am sure I cannot tell you. I never met the chap before this voyage. He came on board at King George's Sound, where I also embarked, but he never spoke to me until we were in the Mediterranean. On the whole, Bell, I am inclined to like him. He seems to be downright and honest. He knows a great deal about the bush, too, as he has spent several years there." "And he gives you the benefit of his information?" I asked. "I don't suppose he knows more than I do, and it is doubtful whether he has had so rough a time." "Then in that case he picks your brains." "What do you mean?" The young fellow looked at me with those clear grey eyes which were his most attractive feature. "Nothing," I answered, "nothing. Only if you will be guided by a man nearly double your age, I would take care to tell Wickham as little as possible. Have you ever observed that he happens to be about when you and I are engaged in serious conversation?" "I can't say that I have." "Well, keep your eyes open and you'll see what I mean. Be as friendly as you like, but don't give him your confidence, that is all." "You are rather late in advising me on that score," said Cressley, with a somewhat nervous laugh. "Wickham knows all about the old hall by this time." "And your superstitious fears with regard to the turret room?" I queried. "Well, I have hinted at them. You will be surprised, but he is full of sympathy." "Tell him no more," I said in conclusion. Cressley made a sort of half promise, but looked as if he rather resented my interference. A day or two later we reached Liverpool. I was engaged long ago to stay with some friends in the suburbs, and Cressley took up his abode at the Prince's Hotel. His property was some 60 miles away, and when we parted he insisted on my agreeing to come down and see his place as soon as he had put things a little straight. I readily promised to do so, provided we could arrange a visit before my return to London. Nearly a week went by and I saw nothing of Cressley. Then on a certain morning he called to see me. "How are you getting on?" I asked. "Capitally," he replied. "I have been down to the Hall several times with my agent Murdoch, and though the place is in the most shocking condition, I shall soon put things in order. But what I have come specially to ask you now is whether you can get away to-day and come with me to the Hall for a couple of nights. I had arranged with the agent to go down this